Good morning and welcome, and we'll get underway. This is another one of our monthly Smart Cities and Connected Communities Roundtable discussions. Our topic today is space exploration and how it will define the 21st century. It's the first time we have covered this topic, and we're honored to co-host our presentation today with our friends at the Keystone Policy Center as part of their Key Conversations program. My name's Clint Vince, and I chair Dentons' energy practice and also co-chair our global transportation and infrastructure sector. And together with my teammate Emma Hand, we co-chair this think tank. The think tank's grown. We are now more than 800 thought leaders in roughly 86 countries. And before we get started with our extraordinary panel today, I'd like to ask my distinguished colleague, Linda Willard, to provide a warm welcome. And Linda is the executive director of our think tank and also a leader in our energy and public policy sectors in our law firm. So Linda, if you could get us started.
Thank you, Clinton. Welcome, everyone. And just a housekeeping matter, a few housekeeping matters before we get underway. Our next roundtable will be February 19th. It will be part 3 of our artificial intelligence series, focusing on AI's revolutionary potential and vulnerabilities. So we hope you can join us for that as well. And in addition, just another housekeeping matter for the roundtable today, we ask that you please put any questions you might have for our panelists into the Q&A function and not into the chat. So thank you in advance for that. Today's theme is a really important one, as Clinton mentioned, and it's the first time, but hopefully we will have more this year on space, which is just a groundbreaking subject. And as you well know, more than 55 years ago, the moon landing happened and kind of got us started, but our relationship with space has evolved and expanded far beyond what anyone expected. It's now more private sector involvement, greater accessibility, and boundless technological and scientific potential, not only for life in space, but how it affects life on Earth. So I'm really looking forward, I think we all are, to this discussion. And I just wanted to introduce our moderator today, Max Oglesby. We are delighted to have him with us today. He is co-chair of our Smart Cities Telecommunications pillar and will be moderating today's panel discussion. Max is currently a principal at Monstar Lab, global technology consultancy, where he leads teams to deliver innovative digital solutions that drive business growth and enhance customer experiences. Prior to Monstar Lab, Max was a partner at Control Group as well as Intersection, and he worked on transformative projects there, such as reinventing the shopping experience for the world's largest retailer and creating the digital master plan for Hudson Yards, largest private real estate development in U.S. history. And Max's passion for space began in 1994 when, as a 12-year-old, he witnessed the comet Shoemaker-Levy 9's impact on Jupiter, sparking a lifelong fascination with astronomy and space exploration. So I will hand the microphone over to Max, and looking forward to today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you, Clint and Emma and everyone at Dentons for facilitating this. We first started talking about this over the summer, and I was invited to propose a topic to the think tank for a discussion, and it just so happened that I had been introduced to Dylan Hickson by our mutual friend, Shiza, who I think is on the call. Hello, Shiza. And she said, I think you and Dylan would have a good time talking. So I went over to Dylan's office, and about 90 minutes later, we had to sort of stop talking. And I thought, man, that should just be the panel. And I know just the person to join us, Scott Nolan, who I've known for probably close to 20 years at this point. When I met Scott, we were both sort of fresh out of school. And Scott, I think, was involved in his early career, which he'll go into And I was so impressed with what he was working on and the sort of reach of ambition in the projects that he was involved in those days. And he's only gone on to do more amazing things. So I think I'm really excited about this discussion because I think it's the first time Dylan and Scott are talking together, and you've each come at this sort of moment in time from the perspective of engineers. You both have a background in aerospace engineering. You're also both investors, so you have a sort of deep commitment to the outcome that maybe most engineers share part of, but through a different lens. And I think those two lenses are really important in this moment because we're seeing some of the first highly visible commercial applications of the exploitation and exploration of outer space, things like Starlink being at the sort of most obvious end of that spectrum. Without going too far into it, though, I want to give Dylan and Scott a moment to introduce themselves. And maybe, Dylan, you're right next to me here in the layout, so I'll pass you the mic first.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Max. And thanks to Denton for the invitation. I think it's going to be a really fun conversation. I run Arden Road Investments in New York City. It's a family office for my family. I have an engineering background and worked in engineering for many years, and then was drafted in to run the family office. And part of my deal was I wanted us to have a captive venture fund making deep tech venture investments. It's obviously self-serving as an engineer, but I felt like around the early 2000s when I took this over, that we were going to have a lot of interesting breakthroughs in the physical world, the kind of atoms not bits, and I think that's played out very much, and especially in space where we went from kind of a niche exploration to creating what it looks like it's going to be a really vibrant space economy.
Thank you, Dylan. Scott, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, I'll give quick background. I'm a partner at Founders Fund, which is a VC firm based in San Francisco. Firm was first founded in 2005. One of the early investments was SpaceX. Before that was a household name, and after a couple of their early launches, Founders Fund was the first outside investor. Also first outside investor in Anduril, Palantir, Facebook, and large investments in companies like Airbnb, Spotify. So pretty long list of great companies we've been able to be involved in. I joined Founders Fund in 2011 and have been leading a lot of the deep tech or hard engineering investments over the years. Before Founders Fund, like Max said, I was an engineer originally. I started my career at SpaceX as an aerospace engineer working on the Merlin engine systems and Dragon capsule. Spent just under 4 years there, and then went on to get into the business world, consulting, and then business school at Stanford, and then joined Founders Fund after that. So that's the quick history. Excited for this conversation on a topic I've always been excited about.
Thank you, Scott. So, there's a lot of ways that you could get into this, but I thought maybe chronologically might make sense as an organizing principle. And so I think what we'll do today is we'll talk about the past, and I don't mean the ancient relative past of Sputnik and Apollo. I'm thinking more the end of the shuttle program and into maybe the late teens of the 2020s. And then I think we can move into where we are in the industry today, and then look ahead at the next decade toward the end of the conversation. Taking that first lens, reflecting on the past, Dylan, maybe I'll start with you. What are some of the most impactful achievements that lead us to this moment when you can talk about the commercialization of space in the present tense?
Yeah, so sort of this period, from 2000 until now, a lot happened in space. But before that, we went to the moon. That was pretty awesome. We had spy satellites, we had weather satellites, big communications satellites. The space shuttle started, moving science into space a little bit. But kind of early in 2000, a bunch of things happened that made space a lot more interesting. SpaceX was started in, I think, 2002. But there are a bunch of other interesting events. One was the end of selective availability on GPS. And GPS used to be artificially degraded and randomly, so it really wasn't that useful for serious applications. I think GPS is probably one of the biggest impacting space technologies to the average consumer. And once that happened, people could actually build on GPS and trust it. You start having DirecTV and small dish satellite television, as this ramped up, we built up into what we see now, which is Starlink, global broadband, Earth observation, Planet Labs, imaging the entire Earth every 24 hours, and you can subscribe to that data. So I think we kind of had a Cambrian explosion of interesting big companies and small companies doing a lot of things in space. And the question now is, does that turn into a big economy and business model that gets built going forward? And I think there's a lot of optimism that's going to happen.
Thanks, Dylan. I think of your positioning, pun intended, of GPS being a sort of trickle-down effect that's akin to what we saw in the space race technology that maybe filtered out into the general public over a decade or two. Everything from the space pen to exotic materials and things like that. It's interesting that now we're maybe seeing a bit of a gush down or something. There's like a lot of new services coming on really quickly. I think one of the reasons that we're seeing that is the handoff from a sort of government-led approach to more of a private sector-led approach. Scott, maybe you could talk through the business lens of what the difference is. If you look at the space industry in the sort of 70s, 80s, 90s compared to the aughts and the teens, what do you see as the big paradigm shifts there?
Yeah, and Dylan touched on this. And it was, yeah, I'd say all the way through the 90s, it was really viewed as a government thing. It's, space was this national capability that you wanted to have. It had strategic reasons for having it, science reasons, military reasons. And so I think the mindset was, okay, these should be large government contractors that the US government and country needs to support their existence. It doesn't need to be commercially viable. Maybe it can't be commercially viable outside of these large science funded programs, which NASA always did a great job of leading. I think early 2000s, people started talking a lot about small satellites, CubeSats, fridge sats, that were different than the ones Dylan described, which had come before, like the $1 billion huge spy satellites, DirecTV satellites, et cetera. And with those much smaller satellites, the question became, how are we going to, what's the overall cost? We have this unlock on satellite size. They can do all these different things. Earth imaging, like Dylan said, Planet Labs was an early investment Founders Fund made based on seeing what a new form factor could do for satellites. But the missing piece was, yes, you could launch this very low cost small satellite, but if your space launch still costs you $100 million, what's the point of driving down the cost so far in your satellite? So SpaceX emerged to say, as it turns out, there's a lot of the cost is still baked into the launch cost. And if we want to really get commercial space, we've got to get this launch cost down. So SpaceX's focus the whole time was always, how can we get the cost of a kilogram or pound to space as low as possible? And, partly enabled by the small satellite revolution that was happening in the early 2000s, SpaceX focused on a smaller vehicle, smaller payload, just lower overall cost. Let's just get that down and get volumes up. And so that was really the story for the first 10 years was Falcon 1 turning into Falcon 9, getting the cost down that way, even without reusability, and then starting to work on reusability. And then now fast forward another 10 years, we're seeing that with Starship as well, just much larger volumes, more capability. So I think that's been a huge enabler of the commercial space, explosion that we've seen, whether it's Earth imaging, communications, any number of applications. And yeah, I think it was both things in combination that really unlocked it and probably helped enable things like GPS as well.
Scott, could you quantify that sort of saga? If we're at $100 million, and I don't know how much weight that is in 2000, let's say, where
Right.
we are on every 5 years or so.
Yeah, I think the apples to apples is just cost per kilo up to low Earth orbit, let's say. And I don't have the chart in front of me. I was looking at this a few months ago. And if I recall, SpaceX's goal was always, let's bring down launch costs by an order of magnitude by 10x. So 90% reduction. And I think they blew through that per kilo a few years ago. And then I think Starship is set up to really bring that down another 10x. I think that's roughly what we're looking at. So that goal's, I think, been achieved, but yeah, the next step is to just keep going. So I think that'll relentlessly be their focus for, pretty much forever. And then that's unlocked things like Starlink, which I'm sure we'll talk about later.
When you look at that difference just in the feasibility of putting things in orbit, Dylan, in our previous conversations, we've tried to talk about analogies. What comes to mind in human history as a similar sort of paradigm shift in the ease of achieving something? Are there any analogies or past examples that you think of?
Well, I'm a fan of Ray Kurzweil, and he always talks about the accelerating rate of return. And there are a bunch of exponential curves that you can follow over time. But in that more physical world is probably transportation. Transportation was very expensive and very hard to move long distances, and now we jump in a car or a train or a plane and don't think twice about it. I think Scott laid this out clearly. SpaceX said we're gonna be 10x better, and they just took a very different approach, because if you want to be 10x better, you can't use exquisite hardware, you can't do special things, and they sort of set the whole path for how that will happen. And the interesting thing now is that's now cascaded to the satellite operators. And all of a sudden, if launch gets really cheap, maybe it doesn't make sense to make a really expensive, incredible satellite that has to last for 30 years. Maybe you make a larger number of smaller satellites that last for less time. So that whole, like, in the same way, transportation, enabling transportation causes a bunch of other cascading effects to happen. I think SpaceX being there with not just cheap, but reliable launch has allowed people to build business plans. And, the Planet Labs guys, I mean, I can't say I was smart enough to believe they could do it when they were a bunch of guys in a garage just building, shoebox-sized satellites. But they pulled that off, and it made sense because the launch was so cheap.
Interesting. If you cast your memory back, Dylan, to sort of, let's say, 2005 or something, maybe 10, when SpaceX is launching and they're failing and it's unclear if they're going to be successful. Where we are today, is this a surprising amount of success? Do you think, like, if you thought, where will we be in 15 years in 2005, or I guess it's 20 years now, are you surprised, or has it sort of moved at the pace you thought was feasible?
I think, technologically it's not so surprising, but the pace does surprise me. And I remember when SpaceX first started coming to prominence, I went and talked to some of my professors at Caltech, and they were saying, well, Elon's not really inventing anything new. He's just recycling old technology. And I thought, wow, great. Like that's actually a great approach, just to optimize the current technology. So it definitely has gone, Elon, and Scott knows this from working for him. He has an incredible drive, and he is wartime CEO every day. So he never rests on his laurels. SpaceX will achieve a huge milestone, and he'll have a meeting that afternoon and tell everyone how they have to speed up the next milestone. So I think Starship is pretty impressive, but technologically, I think it's not that surprising, but the speed at which they've been able to make this happen, the speed and the volume. SpaceX, I think last year, SpaceX was 85% of the total mass to orbit for the planet Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And just that rate is incredible.
Yeah. It's I want to stick a pin in that answer because I think later in the conversation we'll forecast a bit and talk about where we might be in 20 years. And so if you're able to maintain that pace of innovation, it sort of gives a baseline for what the difference might be, which is interesting. One other question is sort of in the same vein. I think if you think about the future of the commercialization of space, I tend to believe that we haven't yet thought of the ultimate use cases, plural. And so I want to ask Scott a similar question that I asked you, Dylan. If you went back to 2005, Scott, and had to forecast where we'd be in 2025, are there use cases you would have predicted would have been unlocked by now? Or are there use cases that you're sort of surprised to see exist sooner than, or in a different form than you'd anticipated?
Yeah, I think back in what now 20 years ago, 2005, people were talking about space tourism a little bit, and there were some startups that were saying, hey, we can make private space stations, inflatable space stations that people could go to and they could look down on the Earth. And it's, I mean, you think of the sci-fi stories and it was always people traveling to space. And so I think people assumed or thought that's going to be a likely thing that we see. Maybe it's small scale, not for everybody, but it seemed like a cool thing to look forward to.
Mm-hmm.
And then that hasn't really played out, at least as quickly as people thought. It's expensive. Cost benefit maybe doesn't totally make sense. But then this whole other thing that's way more revolutionary than just going on, a recreational trip up to orbit has happened, which is space communications, Starlink, direct to cell from space. Pretty crazy. I don't think anyone really had this on their radar 20 years ago. There were concepts of it, of, okay, maybe someday you have this global communication system, but it just seemed much further out. And I think that's been a place where, like, I guess you could say, like, the computer revolution and everything that's enabled those satellites to function the way they do, combined with launch, is where you get this really interesting new capability that was harder to predict because you have these two exponential curves coming together. And to the forecasting point that we'll probably talk about later, that's where it's hard. It's like what things are going to combine beyond just space launch capacity to unlock totally new things. But yeah, I don't think most people thought nearly as much about space-based communications and global satellite networks as they did space tourism back then. And then it's actually been the inverse.
Thank you. I want to start to pivot toward the present day, and that's a great sort of topic to use as that pivot, Starlink. I had a conversation a year ago with another friend of ours who's a SpaceX alumnus, and the way he described Starlink to me, I just want to say out loud and see if it resonates with Dylan and Scott. Dylan, you'd mentioned earlier that SpaceX last year launched something like 80% of the mass to orbit. The kind of positioning that I'd heard about Starlink related to that fact was that when the Falcon 9 became increasingly reusable and the launch frequency increased, which, by the way, there's a lot of interesting technology about the ability to increase the launch frequency from Florida that I think is sort of underappreciated. But as that sort of annual volume of launch went from, tens to 50 to 100 launches a year, eventually, I think, if I understand it correctly, SpaceX sort of exhausted the commercial demand, the existing demand for low Earth orbit on some level, and so was looking for a business plan to continue to pay for R&D, you might say, or like, how do you create demand for an extra 50 launches a year or something like that? And so there's a certain way you could tell the Starlink story that might be cart following horse or something. It's like, we got a bigger horse, we need to pull something. Let's get a bigger cart to pull. Enter, you can almost do like you can imagine a whiteboarding session of like, what's the best business to exploit if the goal is we need to pay for a bunch more launches. Now, it's probably oversimplistic and a bit, uh, maybe naive, but how true does that feel to you guys who have been watching this? Like, do you think there is a little bit of searching for a business model to pay for R&D and then stumbling on a golden ticket that, perhaps is a much better idea than anybody expected it to be?
So I think it was probably push and pull. They clearly wanted, if you subtract out the Starlink launches from SpaceX's launch manifest, their launch volume is kind of comparable to other countries. So it is most of it. I think that they needed something to launch on their rockets, but they also needed a revenue model that was going to pay to go and colonize Mars.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you look at all the big opportunities in space, that was a clear big opportunity. We've done SATCOMs before with Iridium, but it was exquisite satellites and expensive launch, and it was $10 a minute or something, and you had to carry a briefcase around to connect to it. I think they felt that they could capture that market and kind of simultaneously create the ATM that would fund the company to go to Mars, but also fund all the development of the rockets to build the heavy lift, which they know that they need to move a lot of cargo to Mars.
Mm-hmm. I think some of our audience may not be as familiar as we are with what Starlink is. Scott, do you want to just sort of unpack what that service is and why it has the potential to be very transformative?
Yeah. So Starlink is a satellite network that SpaceX launched on their launch vehicles with thousands of satellites in low Earth orbit that communicate with ground stations to pull data up from Earth, from the internet, from telecom, up into the satellite network, and then push it around to other satellites, push that data around to, pull it to various spots around the globe, or push it back down to customer dishes called user terminals on the ground, so that customers who are in remote places, suburban places, even urban places, can get data directly to their dish. And so it's basically a satellite-based internet service that utilizes ground stations around the world and utilizes satellite-to-satellite connections. And so think of it as internet anywhere you want it, on a dish that you can put in a backpack, or even at this point, even potentially smaller, for I think roughly $100 a month. So that's what the service is. I think going back to how it came about, there's certainly like the business angle to it of how do we pay to colonize Mars? Is this something we can go capture? I'd say the other like attitude thing I always saw at SpaceX was, it was kind of like, hey, there's these things that will make humanity better that hopefully someone else goes and does, and then if no one else is going to do it, fine, we'll do it. And we know it's going to be a huge amount of work, and we could just very comfortably rest on the business that we have. Or, even when Elon started SpaceX, all the stories I've read are that he wanted humanity to be multiplanetary, colonize the stars, travel the solar system, go to Mars. And out of the gates, he didn't even want to start SpaceX. He wanted to put a plant in a little terrarium on Mars to show that life could exist on Mars. And then he went to Russia and talked to them about, hey, could you help launch these rockets? And that's how he found out that the launch costs were so incredibly high, and concluded, okay, I guess someone's got to go start a rocket company to bring this cost down. And so, through that, you just see this relentless focus on the cost element, because of this idea that to get humanity multiplanetary, we've got to bring down the cost.
Mhm.
And so I think that sort of, if we don't do it, no one's going to do it attitude is really probably what also led to Starlink. You could point to the business opportunity, but I think you could also point to, okay, humanity needs better communication. It's this obvious thing of it should be in the sky and not on wires on the ground. And what you would have to be able to do to pull that off is launch a lot of mass to orbit cheaply. And, SpaceX's position was the only low cost launcher, really the lowest cost by a lot once you had reusability going on Falcon 9. And then the only company that was really positioned to increase volumes dramatically through another 10 years of really hard work of scaling production. So, I think it's almost like, yes, there's the business opportunity, but also it's kind of put on their shoulders as the only ones who can realistically do it. And so then anytime that's the case, they kind of, that team steps up and says, okay, we're gonna make another really, really hard push. To Dylan's point, it's not, oh, we achieved this, now we get to relax and go take some vacation time. It's more like, great, we achieved this, and now we're even more, responsible for the next chapter.
Mhm. I'm inspired to talk about Starlink just a little bit more, because I think for the audience who are members and sort of in the community of this think tank, which is Clint outlined at the beginning, is about smart cities and connected communities. This Starlink service, I think, will be the first time the maybe average citizen starts to really notice a daily difference. And if you're like me, someone who fantasizes about van life, hashtag van life, or living off the grid, or connecting to the internet while at a dark sky site doing astronomy, as I do. Starlink's a complete game changer. You're starting to see airlines come on board, and so you'll be on a commercial airline sometime in the next 12 months and have super fast internet and say, hey, what the heck just happened? You might be on a cruise ship in the middle of the Atlantic and on a Zoom call like this one. Maybe that describes somebody who's in the audience today. Those are really game-changing, crazy experiences. And I think as a person who follows urban planning, and I know, Dylan, that's an interest and sort of stake that you hold, I think it's really worth educating folks about what's to come here and talking about the differences. I think now to fully pivot into the state of the industry today, the last sort of piece that I can see on the horizon with the Starlink service is around the direct to cell capability. And so, Dylan, maybe you could just talk for a second about what that might feel like, and maybe you no longer need a dish. What's the future there?
Sure. And so let me take a little sidetrack into orbital mechanics, because I think that there's some interesting dynamics that it helps to understand. In order to orbit the Earth, you have to be traveling 17,500 miles an hour. So low Earth orbit satellite orbits about every 90 minutes. There's a quirk of orbits where as the vehicle goes further out, it orbits more slowly. And there is an orbit where it orbits exactly once a day. That's called geostationary orbit. So if you send a satellite there, it's 22,500 miles away. If you put a satellite there, it orbits at the same speed that the Earth does, and that allows you to be over the same point at all times. That's how all communication satellites work. They're very big, school bus sized. They have to serve a lot of people. There's a lot of delay because the actual speed of light, is almost a second round trip back and forth if you're talking to someone. So when you put a satellite in LEO, that's only 300 miles. That's LA to San Francisco. That's very close to the surface, but it's whipping past at 17,000 miles an hour. So you need a lot of satellites so that there's always one over you. And this is what they call proliferated LEO. If you have enough, you need enough satellites so that, if you're in 45-degree cone, you can see a couple of satellites and get your connection. It's daunting to build a network like that because you need so many satellites to cover the Earth. And until you have all those satellites, you don't cover anywhere on Earth because you would have holes. But the corollary to that is once you've covered one place on Earth, you've effectively covered everywhere on Earth. And so it's not like SpaceX has to turn on different continents. When they talk about turning on a country, that just means they got regulatory approval to start broadcasting. The satellites are always there. So I think SpaceX has almost 7,000 Starlink satellites now. You can go online and look at a Starlink tracker. It's just a total mass over the globe. But what that's done is it's now, including polar regions, it's enabled fast broadband connections anywhere. And I brought a little show and tell. This is a Starlink mini terminal. So traditional Starlink is much bigger. This is not quite as fast, but this has built into it the router and everything. So I've got a 20,000 milliamp hour battery Velcro to the back. That's the maximum you're allowed to take on an airplane. That'll run this for about 3 hours. So you know, you don't have to aim it carefully. You just plop it down on the ground, get it going, and you've got a broadband connection. And that's true anywhere. And yesterday, SpaceX announced a deal with Apple, which will add to the T-Mobile direct to sell. That originally that was going to be Samsung phones only, and Apple has now said that they've actually been working with SpaceX for a while now to adapt their phones. That's going to be not just texting. You know, Elon is saying medium resolution images, voice, and audio direct to your phone. You'll need to, you know, you'll need to be able to see the sky with a phone. But you know, for most use cases, if you're just trying to deliver information, that's actually plenty, and that means you don't need the dish anymore. But you would imagine, you know, even a village in Africa, they would get one dish and share a connection among a bunch of folks. But if a farmer's in the field and he needs to know, you know, what the price of crops is, or what a particular disease or issue with a plant would be, they're going to be able to pull that information right down off of the network. But the thing to understand is that the whole Starlink network is built. It isn't like, well, maybe, you know, if they get more money, they'll build out Africa, and a little more money, then they can build out Europe. It's up there now, and it's available for anyone that needs to be turned on. There are obviously bandwidth limitations. If you have too many people in one place, you'll saturate the network, and that's why they don't offer it in cities. But the larger Starlinks, which only fit on the bigger Starship vehicle, will have substantially more bandwidth and be able to carry a lot more customers.
And then not to discourage any urban listeners or viewers, but you can get it in cities. It's just there's only a certain number of people who can, because at some point you saturate, like Dylan said. So if you're lucky, it's still available in your city. So definitely still try to get it.
Thank you both. That's really interesting. And as someone who's been involved in planning telecommunications for urban and suburban and rural environments, I can't overstate what a game changer that is. I mean, there's just nothing available except digging up a trench or running some cables or doing some weird terrestrial microwave connection or radio connection or something. And so this just feels to me like a huge paradigm shift. And as I said earlier, maybe the first one where it's a tipping point of perception, where you're like, wow, something very significant has changed in the way that we're using, you know, the natural resource of space. And I think, you know, maybe as big as GPS, Dylan, to your earlier point, although it might take us another 5 years to realize it, something like that. So we're at the state of the industry today. I think we've talked a lot about SpaceX. They're not the only game in town, but they're certainly dominating. Interesting timing. Blue Origin had a successful launch a few days ago. Scott, maybe you could take this one. What do you think of the sort of competitive landscape in launch? Do you think we'll see some actual competition at some point?
I hope so. I think even SpaceX wants there to be multiple providers.
Mhm.
They don't really want it to be just on them largely to move things forward. So I think that's a very welcome development to see that progress. I think the same thing, was true of when Elon did Tesla. He had just always hoped it would mean that the other car companies would start building EVs because it would be a good thing. So I think that's my attitude in space as well. Everyone who's in space and has been in the space sector since the 90s and 2000s, people were excited, even in the 2010s, not because it was a hot industry that was clearly exciting and you could build a huge business, but because of a real passion for the underlying ethos of it. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, I think anyone you talk to who's been in the space sectors, before the 2020s is kind of in it for the love of it. And so
Mhm.
we all just want to see as much happen as we possibly can. So yeah, great development, a lot of hard work. I know a couple people that are on that team, and they've been at that for, also 20 years. So it's great to see.
That's awesome. I was interested to read that there's also some sort of scientific privately funded missions like the Venus Life Finder mission that Rocket Lab is involved in. I don't know, we didn't get a chance to talk about that before, but I don't know if either of you are aware of that mission or following that at all.
Yeah, definitely. Peter Beck of Rocket Lab is very excited about that.
Mhm.
I think they're working with MIT, but it's definitely not NASA JPL traditional approach. And there's a molecule they've detected potentially in the Venusian atmosphere that derives from life. They're going to go and try to measure that more accurately. But that could be, if they make a strong detection, that could be a really interesting threshold moment in scientific discovery, and it would have been a private mission.
Yeah, that feels like it has the potential to be transformative to people's imaginations in the same way the Starlink developments are. Um, Dylan, when you think about the landscape today, what are some of the bottlenecks, be they technical, financial, regulatory, that might hold the industry back? Maybe from the perspective of an investor, what do you see?
Well, from the investment perspective, the problem is always business model. I think, clearly, if you're trying to break the laws of physics, that's not an interesting endeavor. But because we've figured out the supply chain for launch vehicles and satellites and the kind of instruments that go on them, it's a question of putting together a package that makes financial sense and creates a business that works. SpaceX has a business that works really well with Starlink. I just saw a projection of their revenues for 2024 of $7 billion, which would be a double from 2023. An interesting anecdote about Starlink. I heard a VC talking, and she said she'd been lucky enough to go to Ukraine and go towards the front lines and interview a bunch of people and talk about things. She's a hard tech VC, so she was asking folks like, what are the biggest technological breakthroughs that are enabling you to do what you're doing? And she thought that might say drones or autonomy or precision weapons or long range missiles. And she said almost everyone said without delay Starlink, because we wouldn't be even in a war using any of those other technologies if it weren't for Starlink. It would have ended right at the beginning. And so I think we can't underestimate the impact that Starlink is already having, and that's a capability that just was not available before. So clearly Starlink has locked up a really great business model. I think there'll be other comms business models, but I think that's the issue always for VC is if you wait for the market to be obvious, it's too late and you missed it. But being early is the same as being wrong. And so you need to pick business models that are still developing, but have a great final trajectory. And some of those are starting to develop. I think that's really the challenge. I think there'll be some great technological breakthroughs, but I think a lot of folks can just put together off the shelf from existing suppliers some really interesting configurations if they can figure out the right business model for those.
Mhm. Scott, anything you'd like to add?
No, I think Dylan's description's exactly right, where, yeah, the best investments I've always felt like really obvious in some way, not highly speculative. That's probably the too early that Dylan described. But hey, this all kind of adds up, makes sense. What am I missing? And then everyone else thinks you're kind of crazy, which means you're not too early because you see the path, but then it's not obvious to everyone. So there's still so much potential. And I think I don't know, that's the thing about investing that's tricky. You can have great companies, but if everybody realizes how great they're going to be, then it's not necessarily a great investment, even if you believe in the company. So
Right.
there's, as an investor, it's kind of frustrating because there's so many great things happening in space, and then now people are starting to appreciate it. And, that's great. It's happening, but that doesn't mean, just because an investor is not investing in a company doesn't mean it's not a great company. It just means that everybody might realize that.
Right. Yeah. So there's some more competitive kind of nature.
Yeah,
Do,
there's like a reflexive element of it.
do you think, are you seeing, so let's say that there's a test there and you're looking for things that pass that sniff test or detailed quantitative analysis. Do you see more opportunity now, Scott, than you did 10 years ago? Like, is the kind of hit rate going up, or is it even, or?
Probably more now. Yeah, even adjusted for the industry and what people realize is happening. I think if you rewind to, say roughly 2010, it was, I could be missing things here, but it's really SpaceX on the launch side, and then application space, what you could do with that launch capacity. There wasn't that much volume. It was still relatively limited, not that frequent of launches. I think if you search YouTube for SpaceX launch cadence, there's some animation of rockets going up and the timeline, and you realize, wow, it actually wasn't that fast in the early 2010s, and it's just accelerated a crazy degree. So back then you couldn't put up that much mass, and what you could do with that was maybe some small satellites, like shoebox sized satellites that Dylan mentioned, where they were, this big, called 3U. Each U is like a 10 by 10 centimeter cube, and there were roughly 3 of those stacked together, just big enough to put an imaging, like an optical device inside of to look back at Earth and get something like 3 to 5 meter resolution, if I'm remembering right. And that was just enough, maybe not really to get interesting, highly detailed images that would beat, the big satellites in imaging, but you could cover the Earth, you could put up enough of them that you would get daily imagery of every spot, and you could do change detection. And so that was interesting. And so yeah, started in a garage like Dylan said, and then now as a public company. So that was an example of an application, and due to the limitations in launch volume, there weren't that many applications. And so I think it was relatively limited. I'd come from the aerospace industry, and at Founders Fund, that was the only investment we made for a while. Then we did a small electric propulsion company. There's been a couple of those. But now with all this volume and comms and other things happening, I think there's just so much more potential. So the things that Founders Funds invested in recent years include, let's see, Impulse Space, which is a company started by Tom Mueller, one of the first employee of SpaceX, who was VP of propulsion. His whole thing was, okay, SpaceX is going to get all this mass to orbit, and with these big vehicles, a lot of people are going to get dropped off at the same point. Maybe they want to go to a different spot than everybody else. And so instead of requiring a Falcon Heavy, which can put mass up even higher into orbit, why don't we just take them one by one to where they need to be? So it's like a little jetpack that straps onto satellites. So now with more mass going up to the same spot, now there's this opportunity for, you know, if that's like the bus or train, then there's the Uber ride to where you finally want to get to. And so there's that opportunity. There's Varda, which is now putting stuff into space, making pharmaceuticals in space that can only happen in microgravity, and bringing those back in a capsule. So all of a sudden, this launch capacity is leading to all these different things. And then I think we're going to see, due to Starlink, a whole bunch of other applications that could be on Earth or in orbit that maybe they won't be space companies, but they'll be completely enabled by it.
That's great. I want to start to pivot into the future here, and I think what would be helpful would be, Dylan, maybe if you could describe for us the anatomy of outer space. A lot of what we've been talking about is sort of low Earth orbit. Scott started to talk about taking things a bit higher, if that's the right analogy, out of the gravity well. Could you kind of give us the anatomy lesson on
Sure.
space?
Let me start by responding to something Scott said, and I think Jeff Bezos talks about this in an interesting way. You know, sometimes you know, the Silicon Valley guys can be accused of being techno optimists and saying, well, we'll just, you know, we'll figure out amazing stuff. But if you look at how the internet worked, that's pretty much what happened. Nobody planned all the things that we're doing in the internet. Just amazing capabilities were created, and people invented business models we never even knew we needed. You know, the first thing you do is email, which just looks like paper mail, you know, return, dear so-and-so. That sort of develops into instant messaging and text messaging and bulletin boards, and then it becomes Slack, where it's you know, synchronous group communications. So it's hard to predict what's going to happen. But what Bezos says about Blue Origin is, he says, when I started Amazon, there was the internet, there was UPS, there were credit cards, there were a whole bunch of things that I could build this business on. And if I had to build all of those, forget it. I never would even gotten started. Mm-hmm. And so his whole, you know, million people living and working in orbit, he says, if there's heavy launch, if there's satellite construction companies, if there's power and comms in space and all the kind of connective tissue, that entrepreneurs can start to jump in and create these new business models. Like Varda, you know, they make a pharmaceutical that has a delicate crystalline structure, and when you grow it in microgravity, you get much higher yields. So like, great. But maybe they're drugs that we haven't even invented yet because they don't even occur under gravity. So I think that idea of you and a lot of the investments I've made, you know, and I think Scott is the same way, is this, you know, kind of infrastructure investments that when there's a gold rush, you want to sell picks and shovels, not necessarily dig for gold. So propulsion, power, systems, launch. But I think as that builds out, we will discover business models that we didn't even know we needed, with Starlink, but also orbitally. So just the anatomy of space. You know, the atmosphere is a very thin layer clinging to the Earth. Once you get up, you know, they define the edge of space, what they call the Kármán line, is 100 kilometers, 62 miles. Orbits are, you know, low Earth orbit is 300 miles, around there. You can orbit lower than that, but you start to get a little bit of drag, and that helps for spy satellites and imagery. But generally, that's where most satellites are. The space station is at a lower orbit, because the lower the orbit, the more the orbit gets cleared, because there's a little bit of drag, so space junk gets pulled down. So the space station actually is in a relatively low orbit because that's pretty clear. The higher orbits do have some space junk in them. You know, this is something that is there's a little bit of a tragedy of the commons that's gone on that we'll have to deal with. Satellites now have to regularly do collision avoidance as it gets crowded. So LEO is great because it's close. You know, it's 300 miles away. You don't need a lot of transmit power. You don't have a lot of latency. Then you get up to MEO, which is kind of 5,000 mile orbit. That affords you a much wider field of view. You can reach a lot more of the Earth. It's a tougher environment because there's more radiation. But you know, GPS is in MEO. You a lot of the new communications constellations that are being proposed are for MEO, because you don't need 7,000 satellites, because you get further away, you can actually shine on a bigger portion of the Earth. Then you get out to GEO, we talked about, which is geostationary. That's an incredibly lucky and useful orbit. I think it was actually Arthur C. Clarke who invented geostationary orbit. He's a science fiction author, but just said, well, theoretically, if you were to put a satellite, it would stay in one place. And we hadn't, because we weren't launching satellites, we hadn't really even started thinking about that. GEO is very useful. It's full of these big old school bus sized communication satellites, but there's also an interesting new market, which is micro GEO. And you can take a very small satellite, send it to GEO, and it's over one area. So, if United Arab Emirates wants their own constellation, they can't buy 7,000 satellites, but they could buy one small satellite that just serves their country. So that GEO is not, it's not dead as an application, but proliferated LEO is so much better for real-time communications. Then you start getting into what they call cislunar space, which is the space, out to and including the moon. We're clearly going to go back to the moon. Artemis will probably be re-architected, but I think that there's real commitment to go back to the moon, as they say, go to the moon and stay. So there will be some kind of a science station that operates there. Then you've got Mars, which Elon is thinking a lot about. He obviously whispered in Trump's ear enough to the point where Trump mentioned, American flag planted on Mars during his inauguration speech. And so I think that will certainly happen. We'll do this Venus exploration mission. But another interesting quirk of orbital mechanics is that most of the energy to travel anywhere in the solar system is expended traveling the 300 miles up to low Earth orbit. And once you get out of that gravity well, then you can go all kinds of places in the solar system. So I think we definitely will travel other places. When you think about applications, asteroid mining has been kind of a science fiction fantasy for a long time. There are companies that are now seriously approaching that. The way the solar system is constructed is you've got the inner planets, which are the small planets, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, and then you have a gap that has a big asteroid belt in it, and then you've got the gas giants. And then you have another gap, and then you have the Oort cloud of a huge number of bodies, those far outside bodies. The asteroid belt is far away; it's past Mars. There are Earth-crossing asteroids, and there's a company called Astroforge, which just announced their target mission, but they've found a candidate asteroid that's not too far from the Earth and could have a high content of platinum group metals. So, when you talk about business models, it's highly speculative, but if you come home with a spaceship full of platinum, palladium, iridium, rhodium, you're going to have a good model, a good business model. They always joke like that, the marketing is not very difficult. You just go look at the spot price for platinum and then you sell it. So I think as we start to expand out into space, we'll occupy those different areas. One thing which we haven't discussed and we should probably get into is the kind of dual use of military and civilian. The way orbit works between Earth and the Moon is there are these various, they call Lagrange points, these various points of gravitational stability. And those will start to be places where you might store equipment, or a spy satellite might go and park for a while and then take a mission somewhere else. You're going to start thinking about cislunar space the way you think about the seven seas, that you got to carry a battle group. Let's go park it over here because we might be needing it. And so I think increasingly as we expand out, we'll start to think of the near Earth area as more like more like in the 1600s, you thought of the ocean, it was big and scary and far away, but if you built the right piece of technology and you had someone who was skillful, you could go and try to explore that and utilize it for profit.
Maybe some pirates and dragons there too.
Yeah.
Way.
Yeah, there they be dragons.
I want to just shout out to the audience to please put in some questions. We'll try to get to some in about 5 or 10 minutes. So now would be a good time if you do have any, just go to the Q&A and type them in, and we'll get to as many as we can. Scott, now that we've so helpfully heard from Dylan this anatomy of outer space and some of the sort of example use cases, when you've looked at investments at Founders Fund, I would imagine maybe most of them are in that low Earth orbit sphere, or are they everywhere? Like, what do you see in terms of geographic range, if you will? Although I know geographic isn't the right descriptor.
Yeah. It's a lot of what Dylan's, just mentioned. I think these stable orbital points, just to illustrate the physics of it, I find it really interesting because I didn't always know about them, but there's spots where you're far enough away from the Earth and close, the moon's really small, it's weaker gravitational pull. You have to be closer to the moon than you do to the Earth to have it pull the equal amount. And so these are points where it's like, yeah, you're kind of getting close to the moon. You're pretty far from Earth, or there's other points where the sun factors in, and so now you're getting pulled equally by all these different bodies. And so they are really interesting spots to go do things. Most of the startups I've talked to are not thinking about those. I think to Dylan's point, those are probably more tactical of, okay, maybe there's nothing super interesting to do there, but we can get to somewhere else pretty quick and we can hang out for a while. That probably is going to be more military missions, it seems like. On the startup side, you would think that we'd be hearing a ton just about low Earth orbit companies. I feel like we saw a lot in that space in the 2010s, where these startups are usually a little bit ahead of the curve and they're seeing things really early and they're trying to be right on the cutting edge. And they saw that launch capacity was going up. And the first thing they can do with that is put a bunch of satellites into low Earth orbit and do imaging. So like I said before, I think Planet Labs got started in 2009, 2010, probably. And Founders Fund invested in 2012. And so that was one of the first ones. And then you had a wave of additional companies that were maybe not building the satellites, but saying, hey, there's going to be a lot of these constellations and we're going to process the data that comes out of them. And we're going to be the platform for that. And then you had next generation versions of these imaging satellites that did things like synthetic aperture radar. So instead of saying we're going to do one satellite that takes an image, we're going to do a bunch of satellites that work together to be a big lens effectively on the radar side. And we can bypass clouds and the dark of night to image things. That felt like 2010s. And then now since 2020, it's really been surprising to me. It's been more about the moon. It's been about people who want to do moon missions for demos. Some of that early on was funded by government contracts or XPRIZE type applications. Now there's people saying that, yes, there will be these moon missions and we need to set up infrastructure for it, whether it's a landing pad or maybe it's power on the moon so that, it's very cold there. Battery systems don't always last. Other solutions to energy can be very expensive. So there's been people talking about lasers to direct energy onto specific sites on the moon that could then be absorbed by solar panels. All sorts of things that are lunar oriented that I would not have predicted. Everyone's talked about orbit, everyone's talked about Mars. Not that many people have talked about the moon. People have talked about asteroids, but people are even talking about not mining the asteroids, but what if we mine the moon? And that those things that you might get on the moon would be maybe things like water or things that could help you with fuel and refueling in space so that you're at this high energy point on the moon. You don't have a big gravity well you have to get out of. What if we get to orbit and refuel there is, I think, what some people are thinking, or are there other useful assets there that we should be going after? So yeah, to your question, the big surprise for me has been how much is being directed at the moon as a step one before Mars.
I know that China as a government has been active in building their own constellation to compete with Starlink, but maybe even more visibly with moon missions. And I think maybe as soon as next year, is it correct? They may be on the moon with humans in the next couple of years. Is that right?
I think they're aiming for something like 2030.
Okay.
But they sent a mission with a rover. They took samples, they dug down and got deep samples, and they returned those samples. So they are ahead of NASA now in the cadence of their lunar program.
And do you see a private sector race to the moon, or do you think that will be more of a NASA domain in the next 5 to 10 years?
So there are 2 landers on the way right now. 2 private landers, which are funded by NASA. There's a thing called CLIPS. It's like a commercial lunar something payload, where NASA is paying smaller, for smaller, cheaper private missions to go and conduct some science.
That's really interesting. Earlier, we talked about the defense implications of Starlink with relation to Ukraine, and we've just talked about China in relation to the moon. How much, as investors and sort of ecosystem participants, do you think about the defense applications of this space that you're co-occupying, or is it really just sort of not at the top of your mind?
So I think most. Sorry, go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, no, yeah, you go ahead.
Well, I think most venture investors have gone from the Defense Department is a terrible customer, they pay slowly, you don't know what they want, to, well, maybe, they could be a side user. Well, maybe they're a partner. Well, maybe they're the first customer, and then we think about commercial applications after. So I think VCs have gone through some changes on that, and I think the DoD also is explicitly saying, like, there is a front door. If you want to work with us, come and tell us what you want to do, and we'll explain how to apply for these contracts. It won't be this secret, brotherhood hidden process anymore. But it is like it is real. The Defense Department needs to upgrade their weapon systems, and they need to do it in an inexpensive way. Again, this idea of exquisite systems, a stealth fighter plane or a stealth bomber that cost $1 billion each, it isn't really a workable structure. So I do think that part of why the moon, I think, is getting a lot of interest is there's this sort of dual drive, and so there's a science drive. There might be commercial applications, propellant, helium-3 could be something useful for nuclear fusion, and that's much more abundant on the moon than it is on Earth. But ultimately, if there are something like 14 promising shaded craters with a lot of water ice in them on the south pole of the moon, whoever gets there first will control those sites. And the U.S. government is simply not going to allow the Chinese to be the first to reach the moon and start using those ice resources. The thinking is, if there are billions of tons of ice on the moon, ice is water. You break that into hydrogen, oxygen. That's rocket fuel, and all of a sudden you can go anywhere you want. The energetics are that it's about 20 times more energy to go from the surface of the Earth to Leo, 300 miles up, than it is from the surface of the moon back to Leo. So from an efficiency standpoint, if you want to do a lot of refueling, you should actually do it using lunar water. Now, there's a lot of hand waving and steps in between to create that supply chain that would do that. But I think that's part of what's getting people excited about the moon, is that you have this resource that actually could be useful. And if we think about how military logistics play out. If you have a Navy, but all your ships are anchored in one place and everyone knows where they are, and your adversary's Navy all of a sudden pulls up anchor and refuels and goes wherever they want, that's game over. And so I think the U.S. is thinking in terms of over the long term, not losing that logistics battle. And so I think that's going to be that dual force that pushes the moon forward. And I always remind people the National Highway System was a defense project. It would never have been built if everyone said, oh, couldn't we, move lettuce more efficiently if we had a 4-lane highway all the way across the US? But no, it was Eisenhower was in Europe, and he understood the importance of moving your logistics around from a defense perspective, and they laid out that program. And every time they said, wait, are we sure we want a highway all the way across the Dakotas? Like, yep, because that's where our assets are. So I think we will kind of get this, and I think that's part of what's getting people interested about the moon, is that they feel like there'll be support from the DoD and the Space Force. And we're also seeing it in companies like Anduril that are getting programs of record as small, relatively small young companies because they're providing the Defense Department with capabilities that they really need.
Interesting. I'm going to move into some of the audience questions. The first is, and I'll let Dylan and Scott, please just either one of you take these. Are there any early stage startups that you are particularly interested in? And if challenging to share, can you speak to verticals that excite?
Yeah, this probably gets to your last question, Max, of how do we think about it? Are we looking at specific applications and contracts and defense versus commercial? I think it all depends on the stage. I think if it's very late stage, then, if it's a very late stage investment that's something like pre-IPO, then certainly almost any great investor is, gonna want to understand what those contracts are and what's the breakdown and what's this being used for? How long is that contract? Is it a program of record? Is it a trial thing? If it's defense side, and then commercial, are these recurring contracts? How should we think about this revenue stream? But at the very early stage, I think a lot of people just ask themselves, does this feel like something that's important and useful? Is this, one investor described it to me as they were talking about this space company, and they said, oh, this feels like a useful primitive that should be, part of the overall setup of, if you think of the future of space, this is an important piece. And unclear exactly who's going to use it or how, to Dylan's point about the internet, but it seems inevitable that it will be used somehow in an important way. And so I think if it's very early stage, that's the thing I would focus on, is not, is this thing cool, or, oh, did they get this contract? But is this capability that they're building something that doesn't already exist? There aren't 5 different companies going after it with equal capability. And is it going to be an important piece of the puzzle long term? I think that's early stage what to focus on. And on that front, there's probably been a bunch of different things. Some of these companies aren't that early stage anymore, though. So in terms of very early stage, where you would just focus on that, obviously there's categories like launch. I think launch capability up to orbit is largely being solved. I think there's low orbit communications largely being solved. There's putting things up and bringing them back down for specific applications. A couple companies are working on that. And then there's moving things around in space once you're up there, which, again, other companies working on those things, and then imaging of Earth from orbit. I think the next wave is really probably the lunar stuff further out, unexpected applications that are unlocked by being able to put a lot of mass up and move it around in space. So I think I would just think categorically like that in terms of these core capabilities.
Thanks, Scott. The next question is, with the discovery of liquid water on Mars, how do you think this will impact the timeline and scope of upcoming missions?
So water is interesting because water is necessary for life, and so I think that that's an important aspect of it. But water is also logistics. Water is it's rocket fuel. It can also be used as propellant in an ion thruster, and that it's counterintuitive, but the majority of the liquid water in the solar system is not on the Earth. There is abundant liquid water all around the solar system. And so you could imagine kind of building a logistics chain where you have, fuel depots around the solar system, and some of the moons of Jupiter have huge amounts of water. There are comets. In terms of Mars directly, SpaceX made an architectural decision to use a methane engine and to synthesize the methane on Mars using CO2. So I don't think they'll switch to a hydrogen engine. So I'm not sure it changes I don't think it changes the Mars logistics tremendously, but it's going to be a great resource for everything that the folks who are going to Mars want to do.
Thanks, Dylan. Next question is, I would like to know what is being done with concerns of space junk in low Earth orbit. With the proliferation of orbiting bodies, any collisions have the potential to create additional debris and so on.
Yeah, that's probably a good description. As Dylan said before, though, in low Earth orbit, if you're low enough, things do eventually fall out of orbit. So even these small CubeSats, the lifetime of those is sub 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
So the collision avoidance is really important. There's companies working on collision avoidance software to make sure that that doesn't happen and doesn't add to the space junk that's there. And so that's going to be important. I think if we can avoid collisions and, test that, shoot satellites, which happened a few years back, that just adds tremendous junk. And so it's kind of like we just have to be careful and avoid collisions and let that stuff kind of deorbit over time. It's, a lot of it's going to be there for a while. But when people think about space junk and talk about space junk, I remember back to like elementary school or middle school, they always talked about the space station and space junk, and a single paint chip floating around in space going so fast it could go through, a sheet of metal. And so I think everyone's left with these images of tiny pieces of dust that could just annihilate a satellite. But the surprising thing I learned a couple of years ago was that a lot of the space junk is actually huge dead satellites that are just up there. And so there's other companies focused on how do we deorbit those huge pieces of old dead satellite that could be the school bus sized satellites. How do we get them back down if they failed unexpectedly before they actually deorbited themselves?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think this stuff's getting dealt with. It's primarily not the tiny paint chips or pieces of dust in space. Those will fall out more quickly than bigger objects. And so part of it's how do we get the big objects out? The middle ground is probably the hardest of, smaller things like, anything probably from like a, I don't know, peanut sized piece to something that's more like the CubeSat. And how do we get rid of those? That I don't think anyone has a great answer on right now. Dylan might know of companies that I'm not aware of that are working on that, but that it is a problem and something we just have to collectively work through.
Yeah, the challenge is there's no business model to clean up space junk. And, so a few companies who are launching a satellite that goes and grabs a piece of junk and deorbits it, but from a business model perspective, that's not terribly attractive. I have heard an Air Force general talking about the idea that the military may want to address space junk just because they need to control their operational theater. And he said, in the same way that we clear mines, we might just go and clear orbits because we need to operate there. So that may be, there may be a public entity that takes this on, even if it's not attractive commercially.
Yeah, and then regulation might come into play here too, where I think some of the satellites going up now, there's some requirement that they have a deorbiting plan. and maybe insurance against that. And so, to avoid if there is an insurer of this sort of thing in the future, people could potentially get paid to take care of things, like the tow truck that shows up when you've got AAA or something.
Yeah, we need a little Wall-E robot, like clean it up.
But once you start thinking about abundant propellant, you might just have garbage trucks that just constantly drive around collecting stuff.
Right.
And then in the propellant thing, I have to mention, I guess we've all been talking about the moon as a source of propellant. Then the alternative is if launch gets cheap enough, you can just launch more propellant up. And I think that's the Starship plan, is you launch a bunch of Starships and they all have a little bit left over, and they combine it into one of the Starships that's up there and fuel it up fully and get it on its way. And the argument is, hey, maybe that's just simpler. Once you're launching a lot of vehicles, maybe that's simpler than adding all these steps of mining and coming back from the moon. And even if the latter is more energy efficient because of the gravity well, maybe it's not more cost or time efficient. Maybe you just ship a bunch of fuel up from the Earth where we've got plenty of liquid water.
Mm-hmm. The next question is, to Dylan's point about Elon's proximity to President Trump, do you believe there will be a continued restriction to NASA's budget that will open the door for more private competition in space?
I think NASA's budget will actually grow, but I think there'll be increased impetus to work with commercial companies. But that's been great for NASA. I mean, I think that Norm Augustine, who's was aerospace CEO for many years, just finished a report with the commission and basically said NASA is stretched too thin. They're trying to do too many things, and they're having trouble with many of them. I think if NASA focuses down on their key science missions and some of the things they do better than anyone on Earth, it will actually help them to farm out some of that work to some of the easier work, like commercial resupply, as they did to SpaceX for the space station, to commercial suppliers.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think it's zero sum. I think that's a lot of people naturally think it's one or the other. I think it's both. NASA used to pay $1 billion per space shuttle launch. Now you can get a ton of, a lot of mass up to orbit on a Falcon 9 for a tenth of that. And then that's only going to come down with Starship. So I think that just enables NASA to put more objects up into space and send them out on science missions, which I think was always NASA's focus historically, was let's push the boundaries forward of human knowledge and capability into these missions that no one else is going to do, and that there aren't necessarily commercial applications for now, but we're expanding knowledge and science. And yeah, cheaper launch directly enables that. And I think everything that's happening in the commercial side is going to just further enable NASA to do more exotic, interesting, like mind-blowing missions on the same budget or maybe more budget.
Thanks, Scott. Last question from the group. Will the first $5 or $10 trillion company be a space company? Perhaps SpaceX or Starlink if it spins off, or someone else?
I'll leave that one for Dylan. I don't know. I've always been a big fan of SpaceX, so I feel like I can't see the forest from the trees. I'm too close to it. But yeah, those sort of numbers are kind of hard to imagine. But it could certainly be a space company. That feels possible.
Yeah, predictions are hard to make, especially about the future. But I think it's definitely in the realm of possibility that a space company could be the largest company in the world, especially a Starlink. That's literally their addressable market is basically half of the people on Earth.
Yeah. I'll pull on the thread that you left there, Dylan, of it's hard to make a prediction about the future. And maybe in closing, I'll try to synthesize some of the things that we've talked about. If you were to make an analogy about the internet and computers, and you looked at sort of mainframe computers with like IBM, into personal computing, into the internet, into what we experience today as the internet, which is got tentacles into every aspect of our lives. And if you said that that kind of happened between 1955 and 2025 or something like that, roughly, what year is it in the timeline when it comes to the commercialization of space? And if that question doesn't make sense, let me know.
I'd guess early 2000s. Like we're, you know, maybe the 2010s with launch capability, we were like in the, 56K modem era.
Mhm.
And then Starship brings you into like DSL or fiber maybe.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, we could probably dig into all the other areas, but I'd say when you put it that way, we're probably still early. As much as it feels like we're way into this, it's still very early potentially.
And when you think about Ray Kurzweil's exponentials, an exponential curve is flat for a long time and then it shoots up. And you talk about the knee of the curve. I do think we're around the knee of the curve in space, and Starship and huge inexpensive launch capacity are going to open up things that we know we want to do and things that we have no idea that we want to do in space.
Dylan, Scott, thank you so much for your time. Clint, any closing comments that you and the team want to make?
I just think it was a really spectacular discussion. You've covered a subject that most of our audience is not really steeped in, and you did it in a way that we could understand, but with obvious insight. And I love the combination of engineering and subject matter knowledge with investment knowledge. So, Max, you've been a great leader in our think tank since the early days and great advisor to us. And Dylan and Scott were so appreciative of your contribution today. You really each did a great job. So I'm going to ask Linda to join me and we'll just give you an ovation on behalf of our audience. And we hope to revisit this topic with you, as Linda mentioned, as we go along. But thanks so much, and wishing everybody a great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.